So looking at the anurans, this group, the tailless, elongated hind limbs, jumpers, swimmers, frogs, and toads, it often becomes confusing for some students that have experienced interactions with some of these anurans, and they want to know the difference between them. How do you tell the difference between them? So I've created a chart that kind of goes through the basic characteristics of each. For a frog, you get long, powerful jumping legs. They can jump great distance. For toads, they have shorter legs. They usually spend their time walking or hopping, making short hops. Eggs. Frogs tend to lay their eggs in clusters, and their young will live in the water. Toads lay their eggs in long chains. Some toads don't lay eggs, but give live birth to young. The young then live in the water in any case. Remember, that's called viviparity. Skin of a frog tends to be moist and smooth. Skin of a toad tends to be dry and bumpy. Frogs mostly are found in the water or around the water. Toads tend to live farther into land and spend less time near the water. Doesn't mean that they don't go into the water. It doesn't mean that frogs always stay in the water. Habitat. Frogs prefer moist environments. Toads prefer drier environments, but can adapt to living in moist conditions. All right, now we're getting into some serious differences. Frogs have what are called vomerine teeth in their upper jaw. And when you do your dissection of a frog, one of the things that you should try to note is where are those teeth in their upper jaw. Toads do not have any teeth. Frogs, their eyes tend to bulge out. They are extended out from the head. Toads' eyes tend to not bulge out. They can often have poison gland behind the eyes. If you've ever heard of some of the crazy stories of people that lick toads to receive some of the hallucinogenic chemicals that are actually toxins that are produced by the toad as a defense mechanism, some people in some places know that there are frogs that they can lick to try to get high. It can be dangerous. I don't recommend you doing it. And for one, you're not going to find any of those toads in this area. Food for frogs. They tend to eat insects, snails, spiders, worms, even small fish. You probably are familiar with some of those things and seeing them lash their tongue out to catch insects. Toads also eat insects, grubs, slugs, worms, and other invertebrates. So similar crossover for some of the things that they eat tends to be larger things because they have to support a larger body mass. In general, toads are larger than frogs. All right, so these are general characteristics, but the thing is, you could find frogs that meet some of those characteristics of toads. You can find some toads that meet the characteristics of frogs. So remember that we're talking about anurans, one group, and this toad group is actually kind of a subgrouping of what we would normally call frogs. So we pull them out and they have some characteristics that make them a little bit different from frogs. All right, locomotion. So amphibians, how do they move around? So we're going to get into some of the systems of amphibians. The skeleton of amphibians is modified to accommodate spending more time on land. Since they have moved to a terrestrial lifestyle, living on land at least in some part of their life cycle, their fins that we would have seen in fish are replaced instead with appendages for walking. If you remember in the lobe-finned fish, we saw a bunch of bones that were in the ends of the fin that kind of resembled finger bones. Well, now we see in amphibians, we see extended bones that go out and kind of form finger-like projections. More and more of this, finger-like projections, less and less of fins. This transition to land, we think, occurred from fish that had bones in their fins, and those bones in their fins transitioned to being finger-like projections by the lobe-finned fish and used for locomotion in some cases and moving along the bottom of the substrate that they live in. Here's a nice picture of a mud skipper using its fins to push itself around, and that eventually gave rise to limbs. Other things that have changed to allow for mobility in a terrestrial environment. Strong skeletal support. Legs in the rib cage are now very good at protecting internal organs. You've got to have vertebrae that link together to form a rigid spine that actually protects and supports the animal. So skeletal support is an adaptation to living on land. Nutrition and digestion, getting food. You can see a nice picture there of a frog catching some sort of flying insect, lashing out with its tongue. Most amphibians are carnivorous predators, except in the larval stages when they feed on algae. They can extend their tongues out, capture prey with sticky secretions. Here's a nice picture of a frog's tongue, and it's kind of interesting to note that the frog's tongue attaches at the front of the mouth, and they lash that part, the back part that would rest towards the back, out to capture their prey. This is something we'll see not only in amphibians, we'll see this again in some reptiles. All right, now circulation, gas exchange, temperature regulation. How do they go about getting oxygen moved around the body, getting rid of waste gases, and how do they maintain a constant temperature? Well, one of the ways that they can get rid of gases or get gases in is through their skin. It's called cutaneous respiration. Anytime you hear cutaneous, it means on the skin. If you hear subcutaneous, that means below the skin. So cutaneous respiration, it means that they get oxygen through diffusion through their skin. They also can get oxygen through bucopharyngeal respiration. It means that they actually have areas of the inside of their throat, think pharynx, mouth and pharynx, and they can actually get oxygen through their mouth and throat. This is a much smaller portion than what they would get through their skin, but they are able to do some respiration through their skin. It should be noted that because they respire through their skin tends to be moist and maybe sticky to the touch. You can kind of feel that slimy coat on the outside of their skin. Also, have to be very careful if you ever catch or handle frogs in the wild, because they respire through their skin. If you happen to have any kind of chemicals or oils or things on your hand that could attach to their skin and damage that nice outer coating, you can actually cause them to limit their circulation through their skin, so it can be dangerous to them. Always clean your hands before and after handling any animal. Circulation, gas exchange, temperature regulation still. In juveniles, the larva, the blood is pumped to the gills as it is in a fish. So it's pumped from the heart forward to the gills. They use gills to respire as larvae. Now there are some exceptions to that. There are some salamanders that keep their gills into adulthood, but most of them lose their gills, or some of them will seasonally lose their gills depending on the conditions. That they have in their heart a ventricle that pushes oxygen-rich blood from the lungs through the body to the heart. Also pushes deoxygenated blood back through 2 atria to the lungs. So if we were counting the number of chambers in this heart, we have a left and right atrium and 1 ventricle. That's 3 chambers. Amphibians are ectothermic. So ecto, outside, therm, temperature, ectothermic. That means they develop, or they depend on external heat to maintain their body temperature. They cool off when they're in water. The water absorbs a great deal of their body heat, so a lot of times you'll see amphibians basking in the sun. Basking just means they lay out in the warm sunlight and they use that to increase their body temperature. So rather than relying on food that they're burning to get body temperature up, they will use the sunlight energy to do the same thing. Nervous and sensory functions. Amphibians have well-developed eyes that they use for finding food items. So now, moving out onto land, there's an increase in dependence on eyes for hunting, for avoiding predators, and as a result, eyes get better adapted to picking up and using that visual information, that light information that's being transmitted. They have a lens in the center part of the eye, optic nerve in the back, and they have a couple of eyelids, upper eyelid, lower eyelid, and then what's called a nictitating membrane. This is something that we'll see in several groups as we move on to land. If you're living in the water, your eyes are constantly exposed to the water, so they stay moist. So in a land-based condition, terrestrial environment, you have to have something to keep your eye moistened to kind of protect it and keep it functioning. That nictitating membrane acts as kind of a cleaning and lubricating structure. So the nictitating membrane, extra eyelid, lubricates and moistens the eye. They also use a lateral line system to sense movement. So we see this less in larvae. They use olfaction, smell, to find mates, food, and avoid noxious chemicals. So olfaction tends to be a little bit more functional when you are living in a terrestrial environment, because now you've got air transmitting smells to you. That's good for finding good smells and bad smells. They've adapted auditory reception, hearing. Sound is slowed down tremendously when it's in the air, and so as a result, hearing is much more important for living in land-based environments, which is a new development for living in life on land, because if you live in the water, sound transmits so fast it's not useful. We'll see a little bit more of that in just a moment. Reproduction. So amplexus, this is the name given to the pose that amphibians will adopt during reproduction. So you're looking at a picture here of frogs that are getting ready to reproduce, and this is not because there is internal fertilization. There's no contact between the sex organs of these two frogs. What's happening is the male positions himself on the back of the female, and he wraps his legs around the base of her abdomen, around her abdomen, and his front legs around upper part of the body. And he actually is physically stimulating the female to release eggs. And so what happens is, during this process of amplexus, if you ever see frogs like this, just leave them alone. They are probably reproducing. The female will lay the eggs, and simultaneously the male will release sperm cells. Sometimes it can take hours for that to happen, for them to fully complete this process. Vocalization, an important part of the amphibian reproductive process. So again, sound is important. Various calls attract mates, indicate readiness to breed or inability to do so. However, there are some calls that they use for distress, that are things to alert if there's a predator or something else is going on, as a warning call to other members of their group. You can see the vocal sac, which is found inside the mouth, that stores air. They can release air over a large period of time to make noise, as well as releasing air from the lungs to make sound. So here are some examples of amphibian vocalization. It's a nice toad crying out. You can see the vocal sac extended on this guy. All right, so you can see a lot of videos of that if you want to hear more vocalizations. All right, so let's talk about development in amphibians. Metamorphosis is a series of rapid changes in physiology, structure, and behavior that occur as they transition from larval to adult stages. Eggs to tadpoles, who eventually grow rear legs, front legs, and then lose and reabsorb the tail. That is complete metamorphosis. The larva looks nothing like the adult. Development. Amphibians breathe through their skin, require a great deal of moisture. That makes them sensitive to changes in the environment. Because of this, they are called indicator species. They function as an indication that there's pollution or other environmental problems if something starts happening to your frog populations. And that is a wrap for everything for amphibians. and we'll move on to reptiles next.